should still be questioned. All right, leaving that. Okay. The Populist Party came along. You might say, I've never heard of the Populist Party. Yes, it doesn't exist anymore. It went out of existence, back shortly after it started. It eventually formed the Democratic Party. Now, they favored, among other things, well, at the Democratic Convention, they wanted reform. Francis Willard spoke for calling for an end to drinking, and again, this is part of the preamble to the chapter, the opening vignette. Francis Willard wanted an end to drinking. Farmers wanted to try to avoid foreclosure. Now, foreclosure was such a big, big problem that my parents, my dad was born in 1920, and my mom in 1922, and they would tell us, don't ever mortgage your house, don't ever mortgage your house. But then every one of my brothers and sisters, I have 3 brothers and 3 sisters, me included, we've all taken out home loans with mortgages due to the simple fact that to today's world, there's no other way to get a house unless you're already rich, other than to take out a mortgage. And I would recommend it. Now, if you're unstable in your employment, you might consider not buying but renting. But the thing about buying, you can deduct the interest on your loans still yet. Don't try to deduct the money you spend on rent. The IRS will not allow it. But you can deduct interest on loans. In the first several years of your home loan, it's mostly interest. Some of you might have some idea of what I'm talking about. But anyway, foreclosure was a big, big issue. And again, that's why my parents told us don't ever foreclose. But then again, folks, if you're paying rent and you're kicked out for non-payment, you're just as homeless as you would be if you were kicked out of a home that you owned. So what's the big deal? The Populists wanted silver to count as money. They wanted 3 things: the initiative, referendum and recall, and direct election of senators, the secret ballot. Actually, they wanted several things. Now, initiative means we want to get new laws going. We want to make the laws ourselves. And if you can get enough signatures on a petition in a lot of states, you can get that law on a ballot and the people will vote for it. And if the people who vote for it wins, it becomes law. And there is the election coming up here in Georgia next week. Some of you might be aware. And anyway, I better not comment because I don't know enough about it yet, but my wife keeps up with that stuff, and I think there's some laws on the ballot, but I'm not sure of that. Anyway, initiative, where the people decide to get new laws going. Referendum, where the people decide there's certain laws they don't like and they're going to veto those laws. Now, that does not mean you can veto a Supreme Court decision, folk. And again, I'm reminded the Supreme Court makes all of our moral decisions for us, and their decisions are almost impossible to overturn. But certain laws can be overturned by referendum. And let's see. Recall, that's where you kick politicians you don't like out of office. Within my memory, there's only been one person recalled. That was the governor of California, was put out of office on a recall a few years back. And but it's pretty rarely done. It's like people today don't seem to care about that. Now, the direct election of senators, that was finally done, because the senators were known to, without outright purchasing votes, they would promise favors to state legislators who voted for them. And a lot of people said we have the best senators money can buy. So they wanted the senators to be elected by the people. Oh yeah, the secret ballot. The secret ballot was designed to prevent politicians from buying votes. In other words, they'd give you anywhere from $2 to $5 a vote. And back then, when the average wage was about $1.50 to $2 a day, $2 was a good bit of money. So you'd get $2 for buying you might get $2. Then the people could see if you voted their way or not, particularly when all the ballots were of different size, different color. So if you're going to vote Democrat, you voted with a ballot of one color, and everybody could see which way you were voting. Today, you vote with a shade, they cover a curtain hiding you from everybody else, and supposedly it's difficult for anyone, or almost impossible for anyone to tell how you vote. So you might collect the money from someone who's trying to buy votes. I mean, I don't know if anybody does that anymore, but, and then go ahead and vote against the person you're taking the money from. But anyway, secret ballot was an attempt to stop you from buying votes. The Homestead Steel Mill had a lockout. Now, a strike, folk, is where that the workers walk out of the job and won't work anymore. And they set up picket lines to make sure nobody else works either. That's a strike. A lockout is where the management locks the workers out and says, you're going to do things my way or nobody's going to work. My brother I went through 2 strikes when I was at Lockheed. My brother worked at Armco Steel and he went through a lockout. And during the lockout, he retired. He had enough points in. He retired and went out west. That's a different story. But anyway, lockout. A lot of the people could not afford the lockout. Workers could not afford to miss the paychecks. Bloodshed followed. Pullman built a town near Chicago, and all his workers lived there. The housing was good, but the rent was high. Well, again, Pullman owned the apartments that his workers were expected to live in. These were company homes that Franklin Roosevelt was later to outlaw, even though, like I said, in the case of Disney, they still have these homes that their college workers live in, not the permanent workers. The full-time Disney workers live off the Disney base, again, because Roosevelt outlawed company housing. But Pullman cut workers' pay, but the rent remained the same. But he himself was still making a lot of money, and his shareholders were reaping the benefits, and he paid out the dividends to his shareholders. The strike resulted that crippled the railroads. At first, the strike was peaceful until President Cleveland sent out federal troops. Now, again, folks, today the government very seldom today does the government send to use federal troops. Now, I do recall once when the government sent in a tank to Waco, Texas, back in 1993. Most of you are probably too young to remember it. But again, that was a situation that got so big that the local police could not handle it. But Cleveland sent federal troops, and the federal troops' job was to get the trains running again. The result was bloodshed. Eugene Debs was jailed. Debs decided at this point he was going to become a socialist and run for president. He ran for president 5 times over a period of 20 years. 5 times 4, 20 years as a socialist. And he got over 1 million votes every time. But he never got an electoral vote. Never carried a state. But he kept running on the socialist ticket. The Socialist Party in those days carried about 3% of the vote throughout much of the history of this period in the late 1890s and the early 1900s. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed, the WCTU. Now the WCTU is still around. They're not as powerful, you might not hear much about them. Basically, they advocate completely dry, a complete end to all drinking. Which was to lead to the 18th Amendment being passed later. Yes, eventually the government did outlaw drinking, but it did not last. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, 2 women sought to give women the right to vote. Now, during the Depression of the 30s, we never had more than 25% unemployed. Now these unemployed figures can be deceptive because the unemployed only includes people who are looking for jobs. But what about people who say, I know there's no work out there, I know I can never find work and give up? They don't count. So it's difficult to tell how many people are unemployed, but they count though as the persons who are looking for work and can't find it. 50% of people in those days were unemployed, much higher than the Depression of the 30s. And people began to see the need for the government action, particularly the federal government. People began to say that the federal government should do something to alleviate the Depression. A man named Coxey, now being an Ohioan myself, Coxey started out in Ohio. He was an Ohioan. Jacob Coxey got together a whole bunch of unemployed men, and they marched from Ohio to Washington, D.C. And again, this was before the Lincoln Memorial was set up, and when Washington had a whole lot of grass. Now, if you go to Washington today, and I was there just 5 years ago, there's still a whole lot of grassland that's not used. But this is before the World War I Memorial, the World War II Memorial, the Vietnam Memorial, and the Korean War Memorial was set up. So there was a whole lot of wide open spaces. Anyway, Jacob Coxey camped in this area of Washington that was open. He was arrested. What he demanded, he and the people with him, was, hey, there's a whole lot of dilapidated bridges, there's a whole lot of dilapidated roads, there's a whole lot of, we need more roads, which was true. We need more bridges. The bridges we have are falling apart, and the bridges are becoming unsafe, and folk, that could apply to 2019 in a lot of cases. People who have inspected say that a very high percentage, I forget if a very high percentage of our bridges are functionally borderline unsafe. I put it borderline unsafe. Anyway, he started saying that let the government start building these bridges, start building these roads, start building these national parks, start building these monuments. Well, he was arrested. He was put in jail. He was sent home. Nevertheless, it symbolized a new way to influence politics in the 1890s. Now, this was to happen again twice. During the presidency of Herbert Hoover, there was a March on Washington, and Hoover used tear gas and other means to get them out of Washington. And Roosevelt, who was running for president, said, "Oh, I've been elected." He was right. So they came back again when Roosevelt went out, his wife went out and gave the men Kool-Aid to drink, gave them some punch, listened to them, but gave them absolutely nothing. Anyway, this was to happen again 2 times later. All right, the election of 1896, the Republicans ran William McKinley. He was the one who profited big from a big tariff and got voted out of office. He was for the rich. Now again, this is Republicans. He favored the gold standard. When he was nominated, a bunch of delegates left the convention. Now, in those days, folk, there was no direct primary. That meant that nobody knew who was going to be nominated. When they'd made it to convention, and they'd ballot and vote until finally someone got enough votes to have the majority. But not everybody wanted McKinley. The Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan. The Populists also nominated Bryan, figuring they have a better chance to win if they went with a major party candidate. After this, the Populist Party was dead. The Populists joined the Democrats. McKinley carried on a campaign from his front porch. He would not get out and campaign until the last few weeks. His advisor said, "Mr. McKinley, you're not going to win this election unless you get out and sell yourself to people." So McKinley finally got off from his front porch and ran a campaign. Now, McKinley had one big personal problem. His wife was crippled to the point of being a complete invalid. And part of her problem may have been mental depression, just sheer depression. We don't know what today's doctors might do for her, but the doctors in those days could not do much for her. She felt like she had to suffer for either her sins or his. And so anyway, basically he stayed home for a long time. Finally, though, he barely won the election. William Jennings Bryan made his famous Cross of Gold speech. Actually, William Jennings Bryan stormed the convention. He was unknown, practically unknown, and he just stood up and said, "We are allowing them to crucify us on a cross of gold." And the conventioners just rose up and clapped, and they nominated him almost by acclamation. And so much were they in favor of him that the Populist Party joined. Now, with McKinley, I remember reading in my high school textbook that the President McKinley was like so many other presidents. He'd been a war veteran. He'd first been a lawyer. He'd fought in the Civil War. He'd then been a legislator, lawyer, war veteran, legislator. But his administration turned things around. He is sometimes called the first modern president. Now, folk, on a personal note, I am not related to any of the presidents, but one of my cousins on her mother's side, not my side of the family, no, on her father's side, pardon me, her father was an in-law. One of my cousins on my father's side was related to William McKinley. So I have a little bit of an affinity for him. But anyway, under him, for the first time, the president would go out and visit areas that had been stricken by storms. No president before had done that, but he would visit areas that had been stricken by storms. And he broke from Washington's policy of isolationism and got the United States involved in world affairs, more so than any other president before him. The United States had pursued an expansionist policy, but we've gotten all the territory we could get now. And now we said, well, we're going to expand outside our borders. Missionaries went to China, but for the most part they were unwelcome. The most famous missionary was not an American, but a British man named Hudson Taylor. They were met by the Boxers. The Boxers were a bunch of Chinese young people who called themselves Fists of Righteousness, or Boxers. They eventually were put down, but not until they had done a lot of, made it very clear that foreigners were unwelcome. John Hay, President McKinley's Secretary of State, said to the nations of the world, let's all trade with China. Before his time, the British would trade with one part of China, the French with another, the Japanese with another, the Russians with another. John Hay said, let's all have an open door policy and let everybody trade with China. And this was done. Now, this had nothing to do with the war with Spain. It was to follow. Essentially, in Spain, the Cubans were being treated very, very badly. The American press took up their bad treatment. The Cubans revolted. Spain moved in with an army and tortured and basically killed the people who revolted. American businesses were hurt because we did a lot of trading with Cuba. So to negotiate, a ship called the Maine. Now, folk, you might notice that word Maine is italicized. There's a reason for that. Names of ships, like names of court cases, are italicized. All right, the Maine, named after the state of Maine. It was sent to Havana, and while in Havana Harbor, it mysteriously exploded. Now, in those days, they didn't know as much as we know about spontaneous combustion. Today, we believe that they had too much coal in one place on board the Maine, and that pressure from that heavy amount of coal put a lot of pressure on the coal and spontaneously ignited the coal to where it blew up by itself. But they didn't know that much then. Today we can prove that by means of computers or actual experimentation. But they didn't know it, so they said, it looks like the Maine was mined. That has never been proven, and today we've got better means of going underwater. The Maine, by the way, is still there in Havana Harbor. Anyway, it became a war cry. Remember the Maine and down with Spain. The United States declared war on Cuba, and it's one of our more unjust wars, perhaps, even though it's true that Cubans were being mistreated. But anyway, the United States defeated Spain. By the way, this war is called the Spanish-American War. The United States went to the Philippines, which was owned by Spain, and defeated the Spanish in the Philippines. Then Theodore Roosevelt got a bunch of people together whom he called Rough Riders, and they went to Cuba and won a quick victory in Cuba. The United States, when they sat down and signed the Treaty of Spain, realized they could not fight a war with the United States. So the United States took Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. We still have Puerto Rico and Guam. The Philippines we gave back in 1946. Now keep this in mind, folk. The fact that we had the Philippines was to help in large part get us involved in World War II, because Japan wanted the Philippines also, and they initially got it. All right. Here's a part of the story now, folk, that my teachers never told me, and I did not find out until later. The Filipino leader who was rebelling against Spain We thought he was our friend, and all of a sudden he said, we want complete independence. The United States said, no, wait, you're not ready for independence yet. We'll give you your independence when you're ready. So the Filipino leader revolted. The United States moved into the army and fought really dirty, basically using killing and torture as a means to get their way. The Filipinos resorted to guerrilla warfare. The United States went in, not like we did to Vietnam, we went in to win, to conquer. The Filipinos were greatly outnumbered, and eventually the Filipinos were forced to surrender. We kept the Philippines until 1946 when we gave them their independence. All right. With that,